Law that I want to talk about is the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act of 2006. It's technically called the Perkins Act. And what it is, it's a principal source of federal funding for the improvement of secondary and post-secondary career and technical education programs in the United States. The purpose of the Act is to develop more fully the academic, career, and technical skills of secondary and post-secondary students who elect to enroll in career and technical education programs. The Perkins Act originated from what's called the Smith-Hughes National Vocational Educational Act of 1917, which was also a spin-off and expansion from the 1914 Smith-Lever Act. The original intent of the law, which I think is a little funny on this, it was to avoid the rating of vocational funds by other segments of the school. The main goal of the Act, though never stated explicitly, was to identify certain students and teachers as vocational and to protect their salaries of the teachers by reserving for them exclusively certain amounts of federal money. So basically, I guess the school system was they were taking money that was allocated for the CTE vocational programs, and they had to enact the laws to keep from that. The purpose for wanting to secure the funds was so that the government could promote vocational education in agricultural, trades, industry, and homemaking. While the policy at the federal level moved from the original focus of national defense to the severe unemployment in the 1930s, the federal influence in vocational programs has really remained largely unchanged. Some of the early emphasis on the vocational education, it went from the early 1900s, the focus was on training boys and girls to work. Then in the 1920s, it was used as a national defense strategy, part of World War I. To tackling the unemployment crisis in the 1930s. In the 1940s, it was used to assist with the war efforts with World War II, and it was also used to meet the needs to provide a transition to a peacetime economy. Also in the 1940s, social policies at the federal level led to amendments by the way of the George Barden Act of 1946. This provision provided vocational education and practical nursing and was a reflection of a congressional interest in the health of the people. Influence on vocational education during the 50s were characterized by the light industry springing from new technology, the emergence of health occupations and careers, and the inclusion of work experience at an appropriate part of public education. During the 1960s, vocational education experienced especially heavy enrollment growth, all the while technical advances were producing increasing employment dislocation. The gap between the influence and the disadvantage widened. Poverty and areas of economic depression, they couldn't ignore those, so Congress responded by enacting the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1961, followed by the Vocational Educational Act of 1963. From 1963, there were slight modifications that was made to the bill, with nothing major happening with it. In 1970, new legislation for vocation, and which is now called Career and Technical Education, was passed and included the Vocational Act of 1973, which was later changed to the Carl D. Perkins Act of 1984. And was also changed again to the Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Applied Technology Act in 1990, to the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Educational Act of 1998, and finally to the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act of 2006. Over the years, the amount of funding that's went into the vocational and CTE programs has increased from, in the early 1900s, it was at $3 million. To the early 1960s, it was at $176 million, to currently the amount of federal funding that is used in CTE courses is $1.1 billion. A couple of the strengths that I think that are good for this law is One thing that the Perkins funding brings me back to as far as the CTE is one thing that Ken Robinson had talked about in his video with the little girl that was she was fidgety in class. There's a lot of students that, even though they're not good in academic classes, or they may not flourish in that kind of setting, there's something for them. And just like the one girl that it was hard for her to focus and sit in the class, and she was disruptive in that area. But when you put her in a different setting, something that she enjoyed, then she was a completely different student. She excelled and flourished in what she did. And I think that using the Perkins funding and having the Perkins Act gives a lot of kids the opportunity to do that. And I personally have had students in my class that when I talk to academic teachers, they look at me and say, "Oh, he's a heathen, you don't want him." But when I get them in class, it's like, I see nothing wrong with this kid, because it's just they're doing something that they love to do now. They're interested in it. One of the weaknesses that I see to the Perkins funding is they're beginning to tie a lot of the funding for our programs. They tie it to academic success. Me personally, I do think that that's you're asking somebody that is a professional certified teacher in automotive to teach and teach people that know how to in English. Okay, I can do well in English, but can I teach it? I'm not capable enough to be able to teach somebody to do that. But a lot of our funding is beginning to be tied to academic success, which I think hinders the CTE programs. As a reflection, I think having a CTE program at any school is definitely a plus. And one recommendation that I would suggest is I think that instead of forcing more of the academic on the CTE, if somehow that they could get the academic teachers to incorporate CTE ideas into their classroom, I believe that, number one, it would give students relevance to what they're learning, and it may bring more excitement to what they're trying to portray in class. All right.